Hey, you guys, welcome to our last class, our last week for HST 3103, American Crisis 1929 to 1945. I can't believe this is the last week of class, although it is kind of weird because I haven't seen you for half the semester, and I really wish that we could be in person together for a variety of reasons, but especially for this week because we are going to be watching and discussing one of my favorite films of all times, and I think one of the most iconic films of the 20th century, Casablanca. And if you haven't seen this, I think you're in for an unexpected treat. And if you have seen it before, hopefully this lecture will help you watch the film in a new and critical way, especially within the context of American culture during World War II, which is kind of what this class is about, right? Yay! So, Casablanca, 1942, is one of the most iconic, beloved, and enduring movies of the golden age of Hollywood. Starring Humphrey Bogart as Rick, Ingrid Bergman as Ilsa, and Paul Henreid as Victor Laszlo, Claude Rains as Captain Renault, and Paul Dooley as Sam, and many, many, many others that we should all give credit to. The American Film Institute's list of the 100 best American movies rates Casablanca as number 3 of all-time great American movies. Any guesses for 1 and 2? You could Google it right now, or you could just guess. Okay, I'm going to tell you. After Citizen Kane and The Godfather. It was nominated for 8 Academy Awards and won 3 for Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Screenplay, the last of which is a little bit ironic, which I'll talk about in a minute. So directed by Michael Curtiz, a Hungarian-born American film director and one of the most prolific directors in 20th century film history, especially in terms of quantity of films. He directed 102 films in total during his career. Michael Curtiz's career spanned from Europe to Hollywood, from the silent era through Hollywood's golden age. He was actually a well-known director during the silent era in Europe. He had already directed 64 films in Europe before he moved to the United States in 1926 to work for Warner Brothers. He was nominated for Best Director 5 times and won twice, including Casablanca. He's an incredibly versatile director who made movies in almost every genre: melodrama, comedy, love story, film noir, musical, war story, western, and historical epic. His films include The Adventures of Robin Hood, Angels with Dirty Faces, Mildred Pierce, Yankee Doodle Dandy, and, interesting from the perspective of this class, he also directed This Is the Army, which we talked about 2 weeks ago in terms of propaganda in World War II. The script for Casablanca was adapted from a play called Everybody Comes to Rick's, actually an unproduced play. It never actually made it to the stage. Now, ironically, I say that it won Best Screenplay because the script had multiple scriptwriters whose work often did not overlap, which also often kind of dooms a story, but for some reason the story rises above it. And that's actually something we can talk about in discussion. The script was actually only half finished when filming started, and there was no clear plan for how it would end. But given the fact that there were multiple scriptwriters and teams of scriptwriters not even overlapping, sometimes not even talking to each other, it's surprisingly coherent and it flows incredibly well. It's like the 3rd best American film of all times, according to the AFI, of course, but maybe someone paid him off. Who knows? Anyway. 6 lines from Casablanca appear in the American Film Institute's list of the 100 most memorable lines in cinema, the most of any film. Any guesses? You can pause, try to think about it. Unpause. Now I'm going to tell you the answer. Here's Looking at You, Kid, 5th on the list. Louie, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship, 20th on the list. Play It, Sam. Play As Time Goes By, 28th on the list. Often misquoted as Play It Again, Sam. Never actually appears in the movie. Round Up the Usual Suspects, 32nd on the list. We'll Always Have Paris, 43rd on the list. And 67th on the list, AFI's list of the 100 most memorable lines from Casablanca, of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she walks into mine. So the studio that produced the film, Warner Brothers, was known for being one of the more politically left-wing studios of the 1930s and the 1940s. They were pro-U.S. involvement in World War II and anti-Nazi even before the U.S. entered World War II. And as you'll probably remember from last week's readings and discussion, there's still a lot of anti-Semitism in the U.S. in the 30s and 1940s. So really, the producers of this film, the Warner Brothers and the other producers, have to ask themselves the question, how do we make a film about war refugees from Europe coming to the United States without explicitly mentioning Jews or Jewishness? How do we make people sympathetic to the refugee plight that sort of erases the association, rightly or wrongly, with Jewishness? Many of the individuals involved in this production, both in front of the camera and behind the camera, were Jewish or were non-Jews who had fled wartime Europe. The book that you read a chapter from for our reading assignment, which is Noah Eisenberg's excellent We'll Always Have Casablanca, the life, legend, and afterlife of Hollywood's most beloved movie. Eisenberg actually in his research is quoted as saying nearly all of some 75 actors and actresses cast in Casablanca were immigrants. And supposedly also, according to Eisenberg, 34 nationalities are represented in the credited cast and crew of Casablanca. So among the 14 actors who earned a noticeable screen credit, only 3 were born in the United States. Humphrey Bogart, Dooley Wilson, the African-American actor who plays Sam, and surprisingly Joy Page, who when you watch the movie, you'll see her as a young Bulgarian woman with a very American accent. The director, Michael Curtiz, was a Hungarian Jew who, as I mentioned, had come to the U.S. in 1926, but many of his family members had actively fled the Nazis in the 1930s. S.Z. Sakal, who plays Karl, the German waiter, was a German-Hungarian Jew in real life who had fled Nazi Germany just in 1939, so just a couple years before the movie was made. And many of his family members actually died in concentration camps during the war. Leonid Kinsky, who plays Sasha, the Russian bartender, was a Russian Jew who had come to the United States. And the incredibly famous Peter Lorre, who plays Ugarte, had fled Nazi Germany in 1933 for the United States. He was actually a very well-known actor in Germany, but because of his left-wing political affiliations, had fled to the United States. And he becomes very recognizable in American cinema in the 1930s and 40s for his villainous roles. Konrad Veidt, who plays Major Strausse, who actually he plays a Nazi in the film, was also a refugee from Germany. And what's sort of ironic is when he's an actor in Germany who fled the Nazi regime, but when he comes to Hollywood, he often gets cast as Nazis because of his German accent. The filming of certain scenes has been reported to have had the cast and crew in tears, mostly because so many of them were genuine refugees. And one thing I'd like us maybe to talk about is what scenes do you think what particular scenes do you think actually had the cast and crew in tears, and why? The movie was written and filmed, well, it was partially written and filmed in the summer of 1942. So this isn't very long after the U.S. has entered World War II. This is maybe half a year after the U.S. has entered World War II. It has a limited release in December of 1942 and wide release in January of 1943. So it qualifies for the 1943 Academy Awards because it had a limited release in 42. However, the film itself is set very consciously in early December 1941, right before the attack on Pearl Harbor. So it's really set in the weeks before the U.S. enters World War II. So a little about the historical context, because there might be some words and geographic place names and political references that you don't quite get, and I just want to give you that context. So in May and June of 1940 is the German invasion and defeat of France during World War II, and there's a historical flashback that takes place in the film from that time. And after this German invasion and defeat of France in the summer of 40, there is a German military occupation, a direct military occupation of northern France, including Paris. So in the film, you'll hear the term Vichy France or Vichy France used a lot. So that actually refers to southern France and French colonies, right? And French colonies at the time included Morocco, where Casablanca is located. So Vichy France refers to southern France and its colonies that the Nazis actually made into a separate state. And technically they are not under direct Nazi rule. They're technically neutral, but obviously the leaders are kind of seen as collaborating with Nazis. So Casablanca at the time is part of this technically kind of neutral, not part of Nazi-occupied northern France, but there are Nazi officers there. So it kind of has this weird status of kind of being neutral, but kind of not. You also hear a lot in the movie referred to Free France or Free France, and that is the government, the French government in exile, led by Charles de Gaulle, who later becomes the president of France after the war. The Free France, the sort of government in exile, is organized from London, but you can actually go to London and drink at the pub that the Free France movement met every night at. You know, if we can ever actually leave the country again and go to London. But, you know, it's kind of cool if you ever get to go there. Anyway, so the government in exile, the democratic French government in exile, led by Charles de Gaulle, is organized in London, but it has a big presence in the French colonies in Africa. And Free France forces are fighting against the Nazis and Axis powers in Africa before the Allied liberation of Northern Africa and Europe. And so that is definitely the context that is referenced in the movie. Warner Brothers actually pushed for a limited release of this film in late 1942. Because the U.S. and Britain had actually begun a joint invasion of French North Africa in early November 1942. So for American audiences, you know, this would have been a region of the world that would be very much in the headlines about World War II. So before U.S. forces are actively sort of engaged in combat in and liberating Southern Europe, they are in North Africa fighting with British forces and fighting with Free France forces to liberate those parts of the French Empire. Right? France, these European countries are colonial empires at the time. So if you put yourself as an audience member in, let's say, late 1942, for most people early 1943, when you're seeing this film in the movie theater, number one, the U.S. has really only been involved in World War II for a year, right? And there's a lack of knowledge by the audience about how the war is going to end. This is really a period of strong indeterminacy. We're involved in World War II, but we're not really sure if we're going to win, if the Axis powers are going to win. And so there's kind of this overwhelming sense of uncertainty about the future of democracy in the West. And this lack of knowledge also, I will say in terms of historical context, extends to the extent of Nazi atrocities in the Holocaust. So there's a reference in the film to a concentration camp, and that would not bring up the same imagery to audiences at the time as it would for us. It's really after the war that most people realize the full extent of the final solution and the extermination of Jews and other groups of people in Nazi Germany. So concentration camp, in most people's mind, would have brought up kind of this image of just like a really shitty, horrific prisoner of war camp, but it wouldn't have brought up genocide at the time. After you watch the movie, though, you should watch the hilarious Saturday Night Live parody from a few years ago of the final scene with Kate McKinnon as Ilsa in the Ingrid Bergman role. I have linked to it on the Google Classroom page this week. If we were watching the movie together as a class, I would show the quote after the film. And the humor is actually based on our contemporary knowledge of what was actually going on in concentration camps, so it's definitely worth a watch. So in terms of the political context in which this movie was made, it should be noted that many Hollywood studios were very reluctant to criticize Germany and other fascist regimes in the 1930s during Hitler's rise, and even into the early 40s prior to U.S. involvement in World War II. So why? Well, first, Hollywood studios are part of capitalist business, right? And European and especially German markets are really important markets for Hollywood films at the time. Also, the U.S. is politically divided. Most Americans before Pearl Harbor want the U.S. to remain neutral. And also, let's remember that there also is a significant minority of Americans who actually, which we've talked about in previous classes, have some kind of sympathies with fascism. And there's anti-fascist movements in the U.S. before the U.S. is involved in World War II, but a lot of times those are associated with the Soviet Union and with communism, which in the 30s during the Great Depression doesn't get a bad rap, but is increasingly throughout the 40s starting to be associated with negative things in American culture. Americans are still very much wrapped up in domestic affairs with, after a decade of being part of the Great Depression. And as I mentioned, there's still a lot of anti-Semitism in the U.S. I mean, it isn't this violent anti-Semitism of the Holocaust or the pogroms that happened before the Holocaust, but there's very much this idea that in a lot of, white, middle class, Christian Americans, that we don't want to be associated with a Jewish cause. We're not going to fight World War II to save Jews and be a part of a, quote, Jewish cause. So Warner Brothers pushes against the trend of Hollywood studios remaining politically neutral regarding the Nazis' rise to power and the war in Europe. And they've always been seen as kind of a more left-wing and socially conscious studio, of course, if it sells, right? So I Was a Prisoner on a Chain Gang, like there's all of these like socially conscious films that have more of a left political agenda, but they're also sensationalized and they sell well. But Warner Brothers has this reputation of being a little bit more pushing the left-wing political envelope than other studios, so this film is sort of a natural fit. And as I mentioned before, your reading for this week is a chapter 3, I Stick My Neck Out for Nobody, from Noah Eisenberg's excellent book on the film. Will always have Casablanca, the life, legend, and afterlife of Hollywood's most beloved movie. And that reading really will give you context to the film and help with some of the questions for film viewing, which are actually the same as discussion questions. So, when watching this movie, what do I want you to look for? First, I want you to think about the character of Rick. This is Humphrey Bogart's character, Rick Blaine. In a lot of ways, he represents Americans' perceptions of themselves and their place in world politics, and how it's changing during this time. So think about how this character of Rick, how does his politics change over the course of the film? And how does his journey parallel changing American attitudes towards World War II in the late 1930s and 1940s? And that's really the core of the politics of this film, is the character of Rick, of sort of symbolizing America in a lot of ways. Casablanca also, too, is often called an American World War II propaganda film. So I want you to think about why so. What specifically in the film is sort of uncritically supportive of American politics and institutions? And, this isn't a film that the U.S. government is saying you absolutely have to make this, kind of like This Is the Army, but it's certainly a film that they're not unsupportive of. So, is this propaganda, even though it's an independent studio making this? And if it's a message that we like, hey, take in refugees, does that make the propaganda more acceptable to us? I also want you to think about how certain nationalities and ethnicities are portrayed and represented. And this really ties a lot into last week's discussion of American pluralism and diversity, and today what we maybe call multiculturalism. You can think of how Germans are portrayed. So there are non-Nazi, sort of sympathetic Germans, like the character of Karl. There's Nazis. There's French. There's Americans, white and black, Russians, other Europeans, Moroccans, North Africans. So are these simple stereotypes, or are they more complex representations? And what work do you think these representations perform in terms of how an American audience is viewing the film? I mean, think about it. An American audience is viewing this film from the perspective of, these are all the people that want to come to America. Should we let them in, and why? Also, kind of related to that, think about how the film constructs refugees and the refugee crisis. I mean, that's one of the huge things that World War II creates, other than obviously wartime casualties, is a giant sort of diaspora of people who are, well, movements within Europe of migration, but also a giant external exodus from Europe to places like the United States of refugees. And so how is this film constructing refugees and the refugee crisis? So, you know, while a number of World War II refugees are Jewish, the film never actually specifically mentions Jews or Jewishness. In fact, there's little to no mention of religion or ethnicity in relation to refugees in the film whatsoever. So why do you think this is so? And what is the purpose of it? Especially given what you just learned about the cultural background of many people who worked on the film. Another important thing to consider when viewing the film is how sex, sexuality, and gender are represented in the film, and what representations reinforce and what ones potentially subvert 1940s traditional conceptions of sex, sexuality, and gender. I mean, I especially want to think about this in terms of the main protagonist, sort of like Humphrey Bogart's kind of rugged, lone wolf, contrarian masculinity. You know, contrasted to kind of the character of Victor Laszlo and his sort of standard kind of mainstream heroicism. We can also think about the Ingrid Bergman's character Ilsa and sort of how she's being constructed in terms of her femininity and her gender, and some of the other female characters as well. Also think about the fact that, you know, film critics often point to the fact that while Casablanca is full of cliches, archetypical characters, standard Hollywood narrative techniques, all of this stuff that should make it kind of a mediocre film, it still somehow transcends these and works as a great film. So what are some of these cliches and archetypes and overused techniques of narrative construction in the film? I mean, what are the things that you look at and you say, yeah, I've seen that a million times? But why do you, maybe you disagree that this film transcends it, but why do you think that so many people think this film transcends this to create something greater? And finally, think about the fact that this film has such enduring appeal. You know, why is it that still in 2020, almost 80 years later, this is still something that's considered one of the great films of classic Hollywood, and that people still want to watch and enjoy? I mean, I've probably seen this film 100 times, and I love it every single time. I mean, maybe that's just me because I'm old and I'm crazy and I'm a historian, but still, I've showed this film in so many classes, and the response is almost overwhelmingly like, wow. I mean, it's problematic. One of the problematic things to think about too, which I didn't mention in the questions, is the African American character of Sam. That while there's kind of like this construction of ethnicity in terms of refugee or refuginess, or at least silence about ethnicity, the character of Sam is very interesting because at the time, he actually was a very well-rounded black character on film, but we can actually look back now at Sam and see a lot of racism in the way that people interact with him. So how do we kind of negotiate the fact that both Paul Dooley, the actor who plays Sam, you know, felt like this is a great role because this character is so well-rounded, but also, you know, the clear sort of perpetuation of racism and things like the fact that Ingrid Bergman calls him boy in one example, and that there's clearly like some power differentials between he and his purportedly best friend, Humphrey Bogart. But back to the final sort of question then is the enduring appeal of this film. And what do you think is similar? And what do you think is different in terms of how audiences react to it in 1942 versus today? I mean, obviously it's a historical artifact. We react differently because the context is different, but what do you think is similar? That's the harder question. What's similar in its appeal in 1942 and today? I mean, maybe it's just great music, right? As time goes by. So that's all I have to say about this film. I'm really looking forward to hopefully talking to a number of you in our live Zoom chat about the movie. And if you can't make that, obviously there's always the discussion board. And I also want to say that even though this has been a very weird and strange semester, that I have loved teaching each and every one of you. And hopefully I will see some of you if you're not graduating again on campus. Please feel free to take any of my classes in the future. Hopefully we'll all still see each other live. And if anybody ever wants any kind of assistance in terms of resources about 1930s, 1940s American culture, has any questions about anything, please let me know. And take care, everybody, and au revoir.